Hi, my name's Olivia, and I'm going to be talking about nature versus nurture and the common traits amongst serial killers. Nurture is generally taken as the influence of external factors after conception. Examples of this are the product of exposure, life experiences, and learning on an individual. Nature is what we think of as pre-wiring and is influenced by genetic inheritance and other biological factors. And then evil, the common use to describe both of them when talking about serial killers, is a blanket term. So it ranges over multiple other terms. And we don't use it as much anymore because we have more of a gray scale when it comes to terms such as evil. Okay, I want you to imagine that it's the middle of the night and your father is pushing you and your siblings side to side to wake you up. At this point, you are still not fully lucid and your father says something. You cannot make out what he said, but it's already a routine by now. You hop out of bed, packing as much stuff in the short amount of time you have. This happens every 6 to 12 months, but it gets tiresome. This was the life of April Velasquez, who is the daughter of Edward Edwards, a serial killer. Edwards told everyone around them all this moving was because of work, but he was just a handyman and a truck driver. As his daughter April describes, he had an unusual fascination with crime, collecting newspaper scripts and contacting the police to join in murder investigations. She also recalls how he would abuse her mother. When April grew up and had a family of her own, she decided to finally take a look into her father. He had wrote a book called Metamorphosis of a Criminal about how he turned his life from petty crime to a normal American life. He even toured colleges, churches, and went on a show called To Tell the Truth. In the book and talk shows, he would discuss how he grew up in an orphanage where he claimed to be abused and discharged dishonorably from the army. After these occurrences, he turned to a life of crime, such as arson and robbery. However, she looked into some cold cases and discovered that a couple had gone missing the same week that they left Watertown, Wisconsin, and their bodies were found in the Concord house where her father used to work. He was the one that killed him. He was a serial killer. Okay, and then this one's going to be about behavioral genetics and nature. So, psychological traits are influenced by genetics. Most studies conducted are used genetically determined designs, including twin studies, both identical and fraternal, both cognitive abilities and disabilities, psychopathological personality, just to name a few. The reason why these traits are chosen is because they already show genetic influence. There is no guarantee that a trait is heritable. However, it is important to note that behavioral traits are not measured as accurately compared to physical traits. Genes are what determine a trait, whether that is behavioral or physical. In reality, one gene has a very small effect on a person. Another note is genes determine traits. They are what makes everyone different. This genetic variation among all living organisms can be categorized into population variation or heritability. When discussing heritability, it is important to note that sexual reproduction to individuals' genes undergo meiosis and those genes get passed on. If a person was genetically influenced, nature, then at least one of their parents' lineage would have the same trait. Continuing on with nature, we have brain scans in criminal trials. So, courts across the country find that MRI, PET, and CT scans are both reliable and relevant in supporting evidence on disease in the brain. MRI image scans can depict subdural hematoma, atrophy, or diffuse brain damage. This can be seen when the scans meet the reliable requirements laid out in the Duart versus Merrill Dow pharmaceuticals. Then an example of the PET scan case. is the court was willing to let a psychiatrist testify about the defendant's lack of cognitive ability to understand the nature and consequences of his conduct or to appreciate its wrongfulness. And then a CT scan shows images of the brain, such as neural atrophy and enlarged ventricles. This can be seen in the trial of John Hinckley Jr. for attempting to assassinate President Ronald Reagan, which he wounded 3 people in the process. A police officer named Thomas Delaney, a Secret Service agent named Timothy McCartney, and Reagan's press secretary, James Brady. His defense team argued that Hinckley suffered from some sort of mental defect because a CT scan showed some neural atrophy and enlarged ventricles. While we cannot guarantee that the image caused Hinckley to be found guilty, it is highly probable that that was what caused him to be found not guilty in the case. And then neuroscience data in criminal trials leads to the concern for the Christmas tree effect, which this is where a colorful brain image might affect the jury's views on a trial, leading them to have the defendant be not guilty. Okay, and then moving on to nurture, we have the environmental aspects. So the first environmental aspect is the objective environments, which are shared environments that may be observed by researchers. So this could be having parents going through a divorce, being born into affluent suburbs, or even living out in the outback. And then effective environments are defined by the outcome, also what environments lead to. 2 different environments can be effectively shared if they both result in mental illness. And then the third one is the perceived environment. And this is the mediator between environmental stimulus and behavioral response. Okay, and then we're going to talk about parental importance. So psychologists have assumed that parents are one of the most critical factors in shaping a child's psychology. There are 2 ways narcissism can develop in infants. The first is when it's acknowledged by the mother, where they feel worthy and valued. This can be described as a mirroring experience, an internalized and healthy esteem. And then this second is to be able to admire another. Normally, this is the father figure. The father is seen as powerful and good, so the infant believes they are also a part of that. And then a common trait for serial killers is that mothers tend to be overpowering, over-controlling, and were seductive. The child, in this case the serial killer, would not have the ability to light up their mother's face, resulting in not a sufficient mirroring or idealization. And so for the children did not feel like they were needed or loved by their mother. Okay, and then the effects of child abuse in serial killers. Child abuse causes children and adults to have low self-esteem. For serial killers, early objective relationships were dysfunctional, causing less attachment to objects and people, creating pathological narcissism. Serial killers have addictive behaviors, which can include drug abuse, obsession with death, an insatiable sex drive, so on and so forth. And then this also follows along with aggression and then more mental and physical health problems. So what has a larger effect, nature or nurture? As I expected before conducting all this research, I was not going to get a definite answer whether nature had more of effect or nurture had more effect. A lot of my sources were either unbiased and chose to play off both sides, or they would just favor one side and not talk about the other. So for nature, I listed one of the perspectives, was that the controversy and conflict surrounding behavioral genetics had the positive effect of motivating bigger and better studies that met the high standard of evidence needed to convince skeptical psychological scientists of the importance of genetics in the development of an individual differences in behavior. So basically, meaning that genetics do play a role, and they're trying to convince psychologists that genetics do play a role and that it's not just the development. And then nature or nurture. From a psychological standpoint, nurture in child development plays the largest role in whether someone becomes a serial killer. So, saying that genes don't play any role. And then my view is I believe that a serial killer can either be created in either way or by both. Going back to the topic of evil, characteristics of serial killers is not black and white. Instead, it's a gray scale, like the meaning of evil. Okay, and then the next two slides are my works cited page. So thank you for watching.